The morning started like any other. Routine, predictable, almost mechanical. I poured coffee into my favorite mug, the one with a small chip on the handle, while my husband stood by the counter, scrolling through his phone. His suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, the smell of his aftershave mixing with the bitter aroma of my coffee. He barely looked up as he sipped his drink, his mind already at work before he even stepped out the door. I heard footsteps behind me. My nephew, still half asleep, shuffled into the kitchen in his wrinkled t-shirt and plaid pajama pants. He yawned, rubbing his eyes, then slumped into a chair. "Morning," he mumbled, reaching for the cereal box. That's when my phone vibrated on the counter. A single text. The screen lit up, and for a second I hesitated before picking it up. An unknown number. Just 5 words. "Do you know he's lying?" A chill spread through me, creeping up my spine. I glanced at my husband. He was still glued to his phone, oblivious. Then at my nephew, crunching on his cereal, eyes fixed on the table. My heart pounded as I read the message again. Who was lying? And about what? The house felt different that evening. My husband barely looked up from his phone when I asked if he'd be home late. "Don't wait up," he muttered before grabbing his keys and disappearing out the door. I stood there, listening to his car fade into the distance, an uneasy feeling settling in my stomach. My nephew stayed behind, unusually present, hovering in the kitchen while I cleaned up. He offered to help, which was odd, he never did. He asked about my day, my plans, if I ever got bored being home alone. His voice was casual, but something about the way he watched me felt off. Later, as I reached for my laptop, I noticed the browser history had been wiped. Not just cleared, completely erased. My chest tightened. Had I done that? No. Someone else had. But who? And why? The doorbell rang. Outside, the mailbox was ajar. Inside, a plain white envelope with no return address. My hands trembled as I pulled out the photo, me and my husband at a restaurant last week. But the photo wasn't ours. Someone else had been watching. I needed to talk to someone. The photo, the erased history, the strange text. It was too much to ignore. My husband was distant, and my nephew was watching me too closely. There was only one person I could trust. His best friend. We met at a quiet cafe, tucked in the corner where no one would overhear. I slid the envelope across the table. His brows furrowed as he pulled out the photo, his jaw tightening. "This isn't normal," he muttered, glancing up. "I've noticed things too. He's been different." My breath caught. Different how? He hesitated, searching my face. Secretive. Distracted. Avoiding questions. The tension sat heavy between us. His hand found my shoulder, firm and grounding. "You're not crazy," he said softly. His eyes locked onto mine, filled with something I couldn't name. And then he kissed me. A moment, maybe less, but the electricity in that touch sent a jolt through my spine. I pulled away, breathless, heart pounding. I can't." His expression didn't change. But I knew from that moment on, something between us had shifted. I felt his eyes on me before I even looked up. My nephew leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, a knowing smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Who's that?" he asked casually. My phone was still in my hand, the last message from my husband's best friend glowing on the screen. "We need to talk. Tonight." I locked the screen too late. His gaze flicked to mine, something unreadable in his expression. I forced a smile. "Just a friend." He didn't say anything, but the way he lingered made my stomach tighten. Later, I noticed small things that hadn't been there before. A coffee mug on the table, lipstick smudged on the rim. I hadn't used it. My husband never drank from my cups. The air smelled faintly of cologne, one I didn't recognize. The feeling of being watched grew heavier. That night, my phone vibrated again. A different number, another unknown message. "Tread carefully. They're watching." My breath caught. I turned toward the window, but the street was empty. At least it looked that way. I needed to regain control. Whatever was happening, strange messages, missing browser history, my nephew's knowing glances, it was pulling me away from reality. From my marriage. I refused to let it slip through my fingers. That night, I set the table, lit candles, poured wine. When my husband walked in, he hesitated, eyes scanning the scene. "What's all this?" he asked, loosening his tie. "Just us," I said, forcing a smile. Dinner was filled with careful conversation, reminiscing about trips we'd taken, memories buried beneath years of routine. I reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. When I kissed him, it felt familiar but also distant, like grasping at something already slipping. For a second he leaned in, fingers brushing my jaw. Then his phone buzzed. He tensed. I felt it before he even moved. The kiss broke, his warmth gone. He checked the screen, face unreadable. "I have to go," he muttered, already reaching for his coat. No explanation, no goodbye. The door closed behind him. I sat there, staring at the untouched wine, realizing I had already lost him. I waited until my husband was asleep before reaching for his phone. My hands trembled as I swiped through his messages, his call log, his emails. Nothing. No strange numbers, no secret conversations, just the same empty routine I had memorized over the years. It didn't make sense. He was hiding something, I felt it. But he had covered his tracks too well. The next morning, my nephew watched me closely as I made coffee, his gaze heavy, unreadable. "You look tired," he said, stirring his cereal. I forced a chuckle, gripping the mug tighter. "Rough night." He tilted his head, studying me. "Maybe you don't actually want to know the truth." My breath caught, but before I could respond, he stood and walked away like he hadn't just cracked open something I wasn't ready to face. That afternoon, reaching into my coat pocket, my fingers brushed against paper. A folded note, no name, no explanation. My stomach twisted as I unfolded it. "Your husband's best friend is not your friend." My hands went cold. Someone was pulling the strings, but I had no idea who. I needed answers. The note burned in my pocket, its words echoing in my head. I called my husband's best friend 3 times. No answer. A fourth. Straight to voicemail. He was avoiding me, and that only made me more desperate. By afternoon I drove to his office, but the receptionist said he had taken the day off. Liar. Something was wrong and I was done playing blind. I needed air, space, clarity. I stopped at a cafe near downtown, ordering coffee I wouldn't drink. That's when I saw them. My husband seated in the corner, leaning in close to a woman I didn't recognize. She was younger, blonde, her hand resting on his wrist as she whispered something. He smiled, that easy, familiar smile he hadn't given me in years. My pulse pounded in my ears. I stood ready to march over, demand the truth. But then goosebumps. A shiver at the nape of my neck. The unmistakable feeling of being watched. I turned my head just slightly, scanning the room. Someone's eyes were on me. And whoever it was, they wanted me to know. I wasn't thinking straight. The note in my pocket, my husband with another woman, the feeling of being watched. It all pushed me toward the one person who had been there from the beginning. My husband's best friend. He agreed to meet at my house, saying he had something to tell me. I poured a drink, hands trembling as I recounted everything. The texts, the photos, the erased history, the strange presence in my home. He listened, his eyes dark, concerned. "You were right," he finally said. "Something's going on, and I don't think your husband is the only one keeping secrets." His voice was low, serious, and when he placed a hand over mine, I didn't pull away. For the first time in weeks, I felt grounded. Safe. I leaned in. He did too. And then the kiss. It wasn't planned. It wasn't careful. This happened. The sound of footsteps shattered the moment. I turned. My nephew stood in the doorway, staring. "I didn't think you were hiding something too," he murmured. My phone buzzed. A new message. "Now you're part of the game." The moment I saw my husband's face, I knew. He stood in the doorway, phone in hand, screen still glowing. My stomach dropped. He didn't need to say it. I already knew what he had seen. The photos. Me. His best friend. The kiss. My mouth opened, but no words came. His expression wasn't angry, wasn't hurt. It was worse. Like indifferent. Like I didn't exist. He set the phone down on the table, turned, and walked past me without a single word. No shouting. No accusations. Nothing. Just silence. My pulse pounded as I tried to follow, but he grabbed his keys and left, the door clicking shut behind him. My hands trembled. Then I saw it, the note. My nephew's handwriting, left neatly on the kitchen table. "You wanted the truth? Now you have too much of it." A car engine rumbled outside. I ran to the window, watching as he threw his bag into the trunk. He was leaving. Disappearing just like my husband had. I reached for my phone, but another message had already come through. Game over. I tried calling my husband. Straight to voicemail. I tried again. The call didn't even ring. My number was blocked. My chest tightened as I scrolled to my husband's best friend, my last lifeline. No answer. Just the endless, hollow ringing before it cut off. I was completely alone. The house felt colder, emptier, like something had been drained from it. I sat in silence, staring at the clock as the minutes dragged by, my mind spinning in circles. The note from my nephew still sat on the table, taunting me. You wanted the truth? Now you have too much of it. Outside, the streetlights flickered. I glanced toward the window and froze. A figure stood near the edge of my yard, half hidden in the shadows. My breath caught. I stood, heart pounding, and rushed to the door. I yanked it open. Nothing. Just the quiet hum of the night. My phone vibrated in my hand. A final message. You could have changed everything. But you chose the wrong side. My fingers tightened around the phone. I had lost. Completely.